What do Brittney Griner and Walter Ciszek have in common? They both were held captive in a Russian prison system. Brittney Griner is definitely going to be writing and sharing her story about her 10 months there. With Walter Ciszek, it lasted 15 years, and after his time serving his sentence, is then there for an additional 8 years before he finally found freedom and returned to the United States. Walter Ciszek wrote his first book in 1964, and that is entitled With God in Russia. The second book he wrote about 8 years later, and just this week I got a copy of it entitled He Leadeth Me, referring to God, Jesus Christ, who led him during his 23 years in Russia. Before he got to Russia and after he got to Russia, it is a most compelling story. It's a sharp contrast to what we see on TV every day. What we're led to believe are things that we're supposed to pursue, which take us away from where God would have us be. If you have any question in regard to what a true walk with Jesus Christ is all about, you want to get a copy of this book. It'll answer some of your deepest concerns. Let me read just a little bit from the book. Walter had trained to eventually go to Russia, but he didn't expect to be captured. And so this was in 1939. He says, Nestrov and I too became cautious and even fearful. You could not even help that in that atmosphere. We were afraid not only for ourselves and for what we still hoped might prove the ultimate success of our apostolate, but for the people among whom we hoped to minister as well. They had so little in this life that we did not want to be the cause of further trouble to them. We knew, and they knew, there were informers and party members who would report any religious activities. It was even necessary not to say anything to the children about God, tempting as such a thought might be, lest they, in all innocence, tell others about our conversation and so give us away. We had hoped, when we made our plans to come to Russia, that we could begin our apostolate by ministering to the refugees, many of whom would be Polish Catholics, and then gradually widen our influence to serve the believers still in Russia. Instead, we found we could not even bring up the subject of religion with our fellow workers, whether refugees or native Russians, let alone tell them we were priests. And as this realization dawned, our disappointment grew. Because our hopes had been so high, our enthusiasm so great, our disappointment at being unable to initiate any type of apostolate at all was just that much the greater. Disappointment gradually gave way to a feeling of disillusionment and depression. There were even times when I took pity on myself and thought harshly about my fellow workers. I had given up so much, sacrificed so much, risked so much in order to bring Christ to them. And would they not even talk to me about such things? Quote, we will never get anywhere here, unquote, I sometimes said to Father Nestrov, because the people are so full of fear. They would even hesitate to take the risk of having the children baptized in secret or receiving the sacraments secretly. Yet these were the people I had come to serve, the people who were deprived of all means of worshiping God. I wanted to suffer with them and for them, if only they were willing to accept me, not as a fellow worker, but as a priest. At other times, I felt humiliated. The zeal of the communists, I thought, put me to shame, and that they were effective there could be no doubt. Indeed, it was their very effectiveness that made me feel as a priest alien among my own people. I had come to serve, and I could not serve because no one would listen to me. What could Nestrov and I do against the power of this system? The notion that we would ever effectively work in this country under these conditions seemed in retrospect nothing but a pipe dream. We had entered upon what we thought was a great missionary endeavor, full of zeal and enthusiasm, only to come smack up against reality. Things here were not at all as we had envisioned them. We were not at all equipped to face things as we found them. So much for our hopes, our expectations, our dreams, our convictions, above all, our enthusiasm. Tortured by these questions and these doubts, Nestrov and I were sorely tempted to find some way to leave Russia and return to Poland, where we could at least act as priests again, even if with difficulty in an occupied country. The people there surely needed us in times of persecution. The people there would come to us if they knew we were available. We could serve the church there. We could do nothing here. This whole Russian venture seemed now to have been a mistake, an ill-conceived missionary effort, based on hopes and dreams rather than on hard facts, a plan born of insufficient information and misinformation. That was the temptation that Father Nestrov and I faced at Teplaya-Gora. And though our situation may have been somewhat unique, the temptation itself was not. It is the same temptation faced by everyone who has followed a call and found out that the realities of life were nothing like the expectations he had in the first flush of his vision and in his enthusiasm. It is the temptation that comes to anyone, for example, who has entered religious life with a burning desire to serve God and Him alone, only to find that the day-to-day life in religion is humdrum and pedestrian, equally as filled with moments of human misunderstanding, daily routines and distractions as the secular life he left behind in the world. It is the same temptation faced by young couples in marriage when the honeymoon is over and they must face a seemingly endless future of living together and scratching out an existence in the same old place and the same old way. It is the temptation to say, "This life is not what I thought it would be. This is not what I had bargained for. It is not at all what I wanted either. If I had known it would be like this, I never would have made this choice. I would never have made this promise. You must forgive me, God, but I want to go back. You cannot hold me to a promise made in ignorance. You cannot expect me to keep a covenant based on faith without any previous knowledge of the true facts of life. It is not fair. I never thought it would be like this. I simply cannot stand it, and I will not stay. I will not serve." It is a temptation that comes to every man and woman, sometimes daily. That it should have come to Nestrov and me, in the terrible surroundings of Teplaya-Gora, is not surprising in retrospect, and yet we almost gave in to it. We spoke of finding ways to return to Lvov. We argued that it was only right to report to our superiors that we should tell them of the true circumstances in the Urals before any more men were sent on such a mission. We continued our work in the labor camps, looking always for a chance to leave, and resorted to prayer to sustain us in the meantime. And moving forward, and then one day, together it dawned on us. God granted us the grace to see the solution to our dilemma, the answer to our temptation. It was the grace, quite simply, to look at our situation from His viewpoint, rather than from ours. It was the grace not to judge our efforts by human standards, or by what we ourselves wanted or expected to happen, but rather according to God's design. It was the grace to understand that our dilemma, our temptation, was of our own making and existed only in our minds. It did not and could not coincide with the real world ordained by God and governed ultimately by His will. Going forward, we would have understood much earlier that our sole purpose at Teplaya-Gora was indeed in our whole lives was to do the will of God. Not the will of God as we might wish it, or as we might have envisioned it, or as we thought in our poor human wisdom it ought to be, but rather the will of God as God envisioned it, and revealed it to us each day in the created situations, which he presented us. His will for us was the 24 hours of each day, the people, the places, the circumstances he set before us in that time. Those were the things that God knew were important to him and to us at that moment. And those were things upon which he wanted us to act, not out of any abstract principle or out of any subjective desire to, quote, do the will of God, unquote. No, these things, the 24 hours of this day, were his will. We had to learn to recognize his will in the reality of the situation and to act accordingly. We had to learn to look at our daily lives, at everything that crossed our path each day, with the eyes of God, learn to see his estimate of things, places, and above all people, recognize that he had a goal and a purpose in bringing us into contact with these things and these people, and strive always to do that will, his will, every hour of every day in the situations in which he had placed us. For to what other purpose had we been created? For what other reason had he so arranged it that we should be here, now, this hour, among these people? To what other end had he ordained our being here, if not to see his will in these situations and to strive to do always what he wanted, the way he wanted it, as he would have done it, for his sake, that he might have the fruit and the glory. And just another tidbit. To predict what God's will is going to be, to rationalize about what his will must be, is at once a work of human folly, and yet the subtlest of all temptations. The plain and simple truth is that his will is what he actually wills to send us each day in the way of circumstances, places, people, and problems. The temptation is to overlook these things as God's will. The temptation is to look beyond these things precisely because they are so constant, so petty, so humdrum and routine, and to seek to discover instead some other and nobler will of God in the abstract that fits better our notion of what his will should be. And that was our temptation to play agora, just as it is the temptation faced by everyone who suddenly discovers that life is not what it is expected to be. The answer lies in understanding that it is in these things, and these things alone, here and now, at this moment, that truly constitute the will of God. The challenge lies in learning to accept this truth and act upon it, every moment of every day. The trouble is that, like all great truths, it seems too simple. It is there before our noses all the time, while we look elsewhere for more subtle answers. It bears the hallmark of all divine truths, simplicity, and yet it is precisely because it seems so simple that we are prone to overlook it or ignore it in our daily lives. Like every divine truth, moreover, it's far from simple of execution. Its very simplicity renders it at once almost impossible, not just of credibility, but of human achievement. For our poor human nature is too easily distracted. The very circumstances of our lives, so constant and so humdrum and routine, and yet the things that truly constitute the will of God for us each day, are also the very things that serve to distract us, precisely because we are so involved in them, and cause us to lose sight, however momentarily, of this great truth. Walter describes him being detained at Chiszek and then taken by train, under heavy guard, to the district prison at Perm. There he was photographed front and profile. Standard prison procedure: had his hair clipped off, was deloused, put into a large cell, perhaps 30 by 30 feet, where it held 5 people when he entered it in the morning, and by nightfall it was crowded with more than 100. He had always known he might be arrested. However, when the arrest became reality, it happened so quickly that it all seemed unreal. I could not believe it was actually happening to me. I was in a daze, disoriented. My mind simply could not adjust itself to all that was happening, especially the total loss of freedom and the immediate deprivation of all rights or the possibility of any recourse. There was no way to argue, no way to plead innocent, no way to tell anyone it was all a mistake. The secret police had their orders. They were men with a job to do. They simply rounded us up like so many head of cattle. They wanted to hear no protests. They were in no mood for arguments. They shunted aside all questions of innocence or rights brusquely and completely by ignoring them. That experience is something you cannot describe adequately. Anyone who has ever been arrested by mistake or held overnight in jail will know the feeling, but I cannot find words to convey fully the shock, both emotional and physical, that comes over you in such an experience. Helplessness may be the closest one-word description of that feeling, and yet how pale and inadequate it seems to express the reality. The physical conditions were inhuman. The cells were so badly overcrowded, there was scarcely room to move. There was no running water. Slop buckets served as toilets. The windows were covered by metal shutters. There was little light and less fresh air. We were filthy. We had no such thing as a change of clothes. We slept on the unwashed floor with insects crawling over us. The air was always foul. You could not get the reek of that nauseating stench out of your nostrils. You simply had to learn to ignore it as best you could. It was all so degrading, so humiliating, that some men just ceased to think of themselves as men. And gnawing at the mind, through it all, was that feeling of helplessness and injustice. Most of the men in our cell were political prisoners like myself. They really had no idea why they were in prison. Now here is an interesting point. God's way of consoling him, however, as it happened so often in the past, was to increase my self-knowledge and my understanding of both his providence and the mystery of salvation. When I turned to him in prayer in the depths of my humiliation, when I ran to him utterly dejected because I felt useless and despised, the grace I received in return was the light to recognize how large an admixture of self had crept into the picture. I had been humiliated, and I was feeling sorry for myself. No one appreciated me as a priest, and I was indulging in self-pity. I was being treated unfairly, unjustly, out of prejudice. There was no one to listen to my sad story and offer me sympathy, so I was feeling sorry for myself. That was really the extent of my, quote, humiliation, unquote. In how many other ways, too, had I allowed this admixture of self, this luxury of feeling sorry for myself, to cloud my vision and prevent me from seeing the current situation with the eyes of God? No man, no matter what his situation, is ever without value, is ever useless in God's eyes. No situation is ever without its worth and purpose in God's providence. It is a very human temptation to feel frustrated by circumstances, to feel overwhelmed and helpless in the face of the established order, whether that order is an NKVD prison, or the whole Soviet system, or the status quo, or City Hall, or the rat race, or the establishment, or social pressures, or the cultural environment, or the whole oppressive, rotten world. Under the worst imaginable circumstances, a man remains a man with free will, and God stands ready to assist him with his grace. Indeed, more than that, God expects him to act in these circumstances, this situation, as he would have him act. For these situations, too, these people and places and things are God's will for him now. With that, I leave you with an encouragement to read this book. Get a copy of it. Get a used copy, whatever you can afford. Read it. It'll be a blessing in your life, and it could be a blessing in the life of someone else that you know.